Morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. This is the Oxford Internet Politics and Policy Conference, and we are here to start with our first conference of the day. This is on digital markets, perspectives, and issues. So I will introduce our first speaker. This is Mr. Bertin Martins from Tilburg University. He was a senior economist at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission for more than a decade. And he's here with us to give us a presentation about the perspectives and issues on digital markets. So welcome, Mr. Martins.
Thank you. Let me first share my screen with you. Okay. Welcome everybody to this first morning session. I have a somewhat long title for my presentation, so we'll try to make it easier and give you first introduction to what my presentation is all about. So this is a presentation about information and how it impacts institutional change in society. This is not a new subject. There are many historical examples of how changes in information technologies, such as the introduction of writing in human societies or the printing press, has led to an enormous amount of institutional, political, and societal change. There's a lot of research literature on that. I mention only one book here, Leonard Dudley, with the book The Word and the Sword. Institutions, in my perspective, are as defined by Douglas North, the rules of human interaction, laws, regulations, but also informal norms in society and so on. I will focus in my presentation on the impact of the introduction of the internet, and in particular, online trade, online markets, and how that affects economic institutions, property rights institutions, and how that affects institutional change. So the structure of my presentation today, I'll first start with sort of a benchmark setting on pre-digital societies, before digital technology, before the internet came about. And I will explain how this created decentralized markets. And then with the arrival of digital societies and the internet, there's more centralization of information, and this causes network effects. And I'll explain what that means. This centralization of information and network effects has been described in the literature before. What I would like to emphasize here today is a new effect, which is that the social value of data exceeds the private value to the individuals who contributed the data. And that creates a lot of pressure that drives institutional change around ownership and access to data, who has rights to access, and so on. And that I will characterize and try to describe this tension in today's society and how that plays out in many legal and regulatory initiatives, for example. So let me start with pre-digital societies, pre-digital markets. There's a well-known essay by Friedrich von Hayek on the use of knowledge in society. That dates back to 1945 already, so a long time ago. But this is often taken to be the sort of standard description of what a decentralized market, for example, a village market or a town market means. So in that market, agents collect their own information. People go around the market, go to the different stalls on the market, the different sellers, see what is for sale, how much, what the price is, what the qualities of the goods are, and so on. This is necessarily imperfect information, at least when we talk about bigger markets. Consumers have and producers also have no access to all information. There are also cognitive limits in what you can process and store in your mind. Hayek's idea was that the price signal is sort of the coordinating information signal in that market under imperfect information limitations. And he argued that this is what makes modern markets function though not perfect, but in the best possible way. And this has become the sort of founding paradigm, I would say, of what nowadays we call neoclassical market economics. However, there are a number of clear disadvantages to this. Individual data collection is socially inefficient because everyone has to collect the information again and again and again. There's a lot of duplication of efforts. That's not very efficient. Also, price is a very narrow signal, and it's an insufficiently complex signal to convey all the information about the quality of the goods, about the conditions under which they are sold, and so on. In traditional markets, this limit to information cost, and then they've tried to reduce information cost by bringing people together in a single physical place, a single geographical place, like a village market or a town market as one marketplace, and that already saves some information collection costs. But clearly there are limits to that. Now here come digital markets, and what do they change? Digital markets, as we know, they bring participants together in a single online location, and that reduces the geographical distance cost to virtually zero. Anywhere in the world where you are, you can join a particular online market. There are no geographical limits, at least in principle. We know from research, of course, that there are geographical limits in the sense that people have to bridge time zones, have to bridge language barriers, have to bridge cultural barriers, and that also creates limits. But in principle, at least, these markets are geographically unlimited. And that leads to a series of first-round effects that are by now well known in the economic literature or in the digital economics literature. The decline in transaction cost just takes a few clicks to get onto a market. There's a vast expansion of variety of goods. Stuff is to go to Amazon or to eBay, for example, and you see the enormous variety of goods available for sale, far more than in any real-life supermarket, for example. There's also increased competition effect because sellers from all over the world can come together and compete with each other to sell their goods to you. In economics, this is usually known under the title network effects, or number-driven network effects. More users come onto the market and they attract more users on the other side of the market. And so this is a virtuous circle in the sense that there is this number-driven increase in the number of participants on both the seller and the buyer, or even on the advertiser side of the market. Now, we can also distinguish a second round of effects, which is information is centralized. And that is an impact that is often forgotten or is less discussed in the economic literature. We move away from the imperfect market information in traditional village markets or town markets to more perfect information. Amazon collects information on all the products that are for sale, on the prices of these products. It even knows how much is sold. It knows consumer preferences. It knows the conditions under which these goods are sold. And all that is brought together in a single database managed by Amazon. So there is a lot of central information. There's no need anymore for consumers to go around and collect their own market information. At the same time, however, there's more information asymmetry between the platform that collects this information, for example, Amazon, and the users on Amazon, both the sellers and the buyers on Amazon. And Amazon tries to send out that info, use that information by sending narrow information signals to users. Sellers can use the database to send advertising to buyers, and buyers or consumers can search on Amazon and pull information from Amazon, and you get a search result as a ranking of products, for example. And the more information Amazon collects, of course, the better it can serve you in terms of better matching between buyers and sellers, for example. They know what you're looking for and they guide you towards these goods that you're looking for. But there are also efficiency losses in this because often the information signals are biased. Amazon tries to nudge you or send you to the goods that it wants to sell you, maybe not the best ones for you. It sells its own goods in competition with independent sellers on Amazon and may push you towards their own goods rather than those of competing sellers. A platform, after all, is a firm, a private firm, and it uses information to maximize its profits. And that may not necessarily be in the best interest of consumers or sellers on that market. So there is a lot of information bias. Now, the third round of effects here is that both these data-driven network effects and these number-driven effects, they are Janus faced, I call this. So Janus in the sense of two opposite faces. There's a good side and a bad side to it. On the one hand, these network effects give welfare gains for users. You get access to much more information, you have much more variety and choice, and that's positive. You like more choice. On the other hand, these platforms become in a central position. They start to behave in a monopolistic way, and that may be bad for consumers and for sellers as well. So what to do about this? And so we have seen over the last couple of years a number of regulatory policy initiatives. In the EU, for example, there's the Digital Markets Act that tries to reduce this competitive behavior, this monopolistic behavior of these big online platforms. In the UK, there are similar initiatives coming up in the US as well, in other countries as well. So there is this wave of policy initiatives to try to rein in the market power of these big online platforms. So they go to the second bullet point on these slides. They try to reduce this monopolistic behavior, but often they do this at the risk of unwinding these network effects and fragmenting and splitting markets again, and that may lead to welfare losses. So the question is how to balance between those factors, and that is not an easy thing to do. I wanted to introduce also another factor here, and I think this is a new thing that is often overlooked, which is that by aggregating all these data and platforms, the social value of the data exceeds the sum of the private values. What do I mean by this? Well, first of all, data can be reused by others. So if one person collects information or contributes information to a platform, many others can use that same information, and that saves costs for other people. Also, information can be aggregated, and from the aggregate, you can derive new insights that are often more valuable and go deeper than deriving insight from particular parts and pieces of fragmented information. When Amazon has a whole overview over the market and it sees the dynamics of that market, that gives it much more market insight than any individual seller or buyer who looks at what is available on Amazon. In economics, we call this economies of scale and scope in data aggregation. Scale is the amount of data. Scope is what you can do with that amount of data. You can do more things with aggregated information usually than with fragmented information. A good example is what we've seen over the last couple of years in health data. With COVID, for example, we've seen that if we can combine a lot of health data from many individuals together, health authorities can see what is going on in terms of public health, and they can use those aggregated insights to design better health policies. We see the same, for example, in car navigation data, where I contribute my location and my driving data to an app like Waze or other car driving apps. And it's the aggregation of that information that makes these data very valuable. My own individual minor marginal contribution has very little value, but the aggregation is very useful because it helps everybody to get better through traffic. I myself have studied one example in China where the Chinese government has aggregated data emitted by electric cars, battery-driven cars. You may wonder why the Chinese electric car industry has been so successful in the last couple of years. And certainly because a lot of money was invested in China in electric car production, but also because the government of China developed a scheme whereby all electric cars driving around in China had to pool their data on government servers so that government could analyze these data and not only look at where people are driving around, but also the performance of batteries and engines and specific technical parts of the car, and could compare this across many car models and makes and brands. And it would give access to car producers to those aggregated data, which allowed them to innovate and to accelerate innovation much faster than if that information would have been disaggregated. This increasing social value of data compared to private value creates tension in society. On the one hand, especially in our Western societies, we are very much attached, and we attach a lot of value to protecting our privacy, and firms, commercial companies, attach a lot of value to protecting their commercial secrets. And on the other hand, if we protect them too much, or if we block access to these data, we cannot aggregate this, and we cannot produce the socially valuable insights that the aggregation of that data would give. So how do we square that circle? And that, I think, is one of the main questions today in the design of regulation around access to data. We have seen over the last couple of years in the EU, for example, that there are many data access and data governance initiatives coming up. We have the EU Data Act, the Data Governance Act. We have a special initiative on access to health data. We have the Digital Markets Act that I already mentioned. And there are many other initiatives in the pipeline on creating industrial data pools in several sectors, for example. All these initiatives have in common a particular characteristic, which is that they try to bridge that tension between protecting private data, protecting commercial secrets on the one hand, and on the other hand, making data more widely available for aggregation, for generating insights from the aggregated data, and for making them available to other people who might have good uses of those data. Squaring that circle is very difficult. It's not easy. There may be some technical solutions to do that. For instance, confidential computing or in situ data access, where you leave private and commercially valuable data in the spot where they are managed by the holders of these data, but you bring the algorithms to the data server and let them do their computations without actually being able to access those private and commercially valuable data. They can only access the outcomes of the computations that they do, but not the private data. These are possibilities maybe to bridge or to square that circle, but they have their limits as well. So there are lots of unresolved issues here. I just want to point them out. I don't have immediate ready-made solutions to that. But the first question is private data ownership still a meaningful concept? Data are often co-generated between several parties. When I go on Amazon and I search for a product that I want to buy, I am co-generating my activity data on Amazon together with the sellers who offer products for sale, together with Amazon that guides me around and its algorithm that guides me around. So you can have an argument that all those parties have to some extent access rights to those data, and private ownership may not be the most meaningful concept here. This question of the distribution of the costs and benefits of data access. If I contribute my health data to a health database, and researchers may use that data to generate new health, new medicines, new procedures for treatment of diseases and so on. If that new product or new procedure generates benefits for the one who did the research, do I get a share of that benefit? We don't know yet the answer to that. Some countries have said yes, other countries have said no. And there are many in-between solutions. There are also overlapping and conflicting ownership rights regimes which we have to deal with. In all these data access initiatives that the EU has launched, for example, we see that conflict between not only private data protection and collective ownership, but we also see that inside each of those, there are differences. For example, trade secrets protection for commercial firms. It used to be something rather straightforward, what was meant by this, but in digital platforms, nobody seems to have a clear idea about what trade secrets actually means. So this is work to be done still for lawyers and legislators. There's the question of how far digital data access rights should reach. If I am a manufacturer of a component that goes into a car, do I, as the manufacturer of that component, and that component generates data when it's used inside the car, do I still have access to those component data or not? Or is it the car manufacturer who has exclusive rights to this? Or is it the car driver who has exclusive rights to this? We have not solved that question yet. And then last but not least, with the arrival of artificial intelligence, we see that there is a vast increase in the social value compared to the private value of data. Artificial intelligence usually, and machine learning usually needs vast amounts of data for training purposes. So you need to aggregate loads of data from individuals, firms, and individual behavior, and so on. Who owns the rights once this AI algorithm has produced insights or produced new services and new products with those data? Who owns the rights to those outcomes? Can I, if I contribute data to that algorithm, can I claim I have a stake in that outcome? We don't know the answers to those questions. So these are all unresolved issues of institutional change in society, in digital societies. I stop here. Thank you very much. If you have questions, I'm open to questions now, and you can also send me an email.
Thank you very much, Mr. Martins, for your presentation. We will wrap the questions at the end of the session. By now, I will introduce our second speaker. This is Victoria Morozowait. She's a PhD candidate at the Law Department at Utrecht University. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. So I'm actually very grateful for the first presentation of Bert, and I'm very happy to be here. So thank you for the invitation. Today I'm going to talk about my pretty much research topic over the past 3.5 years, which is I call hypernudging, and I'm going to try to demystify this concept for you if you're not familiar. And I'll talk a little bit about changing regulatory landscape for digital markets in Europe. So generally, I'm actually a competition law scholar. So how markets function and the competitive dynamics in them would be, well, my kind of field. But after the start of my research project, a lot of these different initiatives came out in Europe, and that was actually a very fascinating time that made me look at what's going on. So apparently I'm not the best with technology, though I study tech. Here I found how to switch it. So on the agenda today, I just mentioned to you, hypernudging will be the first part. And just to start from this very basic idea, what is nudging, what is hypernudging? And I'm fairly sure for many of you in the audience, that's a very familiar, at least background. But the idea was that a lot of these market-based regulations were based on these very, and they still are, on these very neoclassical economics ideas that people are, and with these assumptions that people are, well, or market actors are utility maximizers. They have this full information, they behave in a certain way. And at some point during the 50s, there was this behavioral revolution with the idea that, well, in fact, market actors are limited by their cognitive and environmental constraints. And you had these concepts coming out from Herbert Simon, for example, like bounded rationality, which followed with Kahneman and Tversky's heuristics and biases approach idea that people use these mental rules of thumb, which are called heuristics, and usually they work most of the time, but then sometimes they don't work, and that might lead to systemic errors in thinking, which are cognitive errors. So building on that behavioral economics research, we had Thaler and Sunstein, who thought, well, we can actually use these insights in public for public good, or that's how they considered it, in governmental setting. And they came up with this theory of the nudge, how to very concretely implement these behavioral insights in policy. So they thought we can use any aspect of choice architecture, or where citizens, people make decisions, and we can alter people's behavioral in a predictable way without changing any options or significantly changing economic incentives. So the idea is that taxes obviously would not be a nudge because they change someone's economic incentives, but if you adjust the framing or a default of certain options, that would be a nudge. This is one of my favorite examples ever, and I think for males in the audience, that's very familiar. This is Schiphol Airport in the Netherlands, and you had this fly, and the idea was to have something to aim at that would trigger people to aim at something to reduce spillage costs. So all of this, the book came out in 2008, and then you had these different policy initiatives for behavioral unit in the UK as well. In the US, Obama administration implemented quite a few programs, but that all happens in this governmental setting offline. And my study specifically looks at digital contexts and non-governmental contexts. So actually, I very much look into how companies and digital platforms can use these behavioral insights in order to steer users' behavior. So just to give a very big disclaimer, I don't look at nudging through this very normative lens. I look at nudging mechanism as such and see how that can be implemented. So people have debated me on the title nudging. That's, I guess, very normal or regular, you can say. But I simply look at the mechanism of nudging. And digital nudging, it has become also popularized, especially in computer interaction literature and with user experience designers. And it's pretty much, if you look at the mechanism, it's simply a digital manifestation of a nudge. So a choice architect or a designer would use user interface design elements to guide people's behavior in digital environments. And an example could be an online default. So at some point before GDPR, we had these pre-text privacy boxes that could be an example of a nudge. Framing techniques, how you frame specific options, and looking also in this more even algorithmic setting. If you go on Google and you type something and you have your rankings, that the framing itself can nudge you. Well, their studies have shown people click on some of the first options. You will never look at option number 5, page 5 or 6. And at some point, we also had these, we have someone in the house. I'm very sorry for the noise you might be hearing, but just bear with me. And at some point, we also had these different concepts that have become slowly used, something like dark patterns. So creating friction or creating some sort of making users do things they don't want to do. Sludge, again, creating friction, so making it very easy to subscribe but difficult to unsubscribe, dark nudges. And there's quite a bit of conceptual inconsistency between these different things, but they can very easily, well, they are all somehow user design elements. So one of the examples I have on the slide is at some point Ryanair, on their website, this is one of my favorite examples, had this insurance option, which they hid in the Don't Insure Me sector. So if you're one of these countries that are quite popular in terms of you're using Ryanair quite a lot, like at some point United Kingdom or Ireland or Germany, you would not even be looking for this Don't Insure Me option. So you think, I have to take insurance. And what is a few other examples, added costs, or finding it very difficult to find where to unsubscribe or subscribe to. And with dark patterns specifically, and these type of dark nudging elements, as a user, you do feel that you've been somehow manipulated. So you do have this negative feeling about the outcome at the end of the day. And when I talk about these digital nudging aspects, I'm talking still about very non-personalized, applied to every user, fairly uniformly type of practices. And my research kind of goes a step beyond. To an extent, it's theoretical research, but there are some examples that we can use from the practice as well. And hyper nudging refers to, in a nutshell, dynamically personalized user steering. So all of these, at some point, I developed this taxonomy, or sorry, not a taxonomy, but kind of framework where I took different elements from the nudging theory, but also human-computer interaction literature. And there has been the beginning of literature on hyper nudging or very personalized, dynamically personalized predictive nudging. And it started with Karen Young and her paper. And then you had these different elements, but they never kind of were consolidated in one place. And what is hyper in the nudging? It's the personalization aspect, is again, that use of data. It's the predictiveness aspect. And also, and I think you might think, well, is it simply a recommender system? Are we not just talking about hyper personalization here? And I think there's that specific aspect where it's really about nudging the right user, but also finding the right time, the right means, and implementing this practice as many times as needed. And I think that's important, that it has also that temporal aspect. And one of those examples that is pretty salient to people is Cambridge Analytica example, where, and I'm not talking about the effectiveness, but just the very mechanism, where the idea was to find persuadable voters and find the means and moments that they're most susceptible and most interested in specific messages, and just target them with that. So in order to steer them. And I think with practices like these, that's perhaps one of the biggest challenges, that you can't really, you had someone like a whistleblower coming out and sharing how these mechanisms work. But we do know that political targeting and marker targeting is very much copied from commercial practices as well. So there's something to be done there as well. And I'll be talking about that in a moment. When I talk about hyper nudging, I also consider it from the perspective, my research is embedded in a perspective of looking at big tech companies, and big tech companies have these respective platform ecosystems. So what's important in this regard, that you do have a very large scale and scope of services. You have continuous reach of users. So if I'm an Apple user, I probably have my iPhone with me at all times. Maybe I have my watch, maybe I have my MacBook, all these different services. So it's continuous reach, but also continuous collection of data. The lead and algorithms, and also interconnectedness of services. So ability to combine and share that data within a particular company. And here I also draw a distinction between inter-platform and intra-platform hyper-nudging. So inter-platform hyper-nudging, the idea is that you can perhaps design these interventions across different platforms. So with a platform agnostic choice architect, think about Cambridge Analytica, where a company was setting out these different ads or interventions across different platforms like Google or Twitter or Meta. And intra-platform hyper-nudging, where if you consider something like perhaps Amazon voice assistant, Alexa, that might be implementing a certain type of nudging. And then if you combine the data and you have that type of nudging going as well on Amazon Marketplace. So you can have different aspects working there. And the harms of hyper-nudging may also be multifaceted. And when you have different digital interfaces that might lead, of course, to different forms of nudging, that's also another aspect I would like to stress, because I think often, especially in policy right now, we're thinking about visually implemented design elements. We don't really think that we're moving into directions where perhaps technologies like voice, like this extra layer on the digital platforms and services, is becoming a way for people to interact with digital environments. And that's also an area where we might have more user influencing happening. And when we think about harms, well, economic harms are possible if you have this aggregate effect on consumers, where perhaps you're being steered towards specific products or services of a specific platform. Maybe there's some sort of self-preferencing happening. But at the same time, you might also have a private harm because your data was collected perhaps extensively. And in the paper, I go a little bit further into that, and we can discuss it because I realize I'm running a little bit out of time. And in the paper, I also talk about voice assistants as this kind of example where as to illustrate how people can be steered and also what kind of harms that might lead. So just very briefly, because again, I'm conscious of the time, deceptive design right now is a very hot topic in policy circles. And we're also observing that there's a lot of conceptual inconsistency on how to define these elements. But a few trends are very present. So what we're seeing is that consumer protection and data protection areas are some of the key areas where we see, okay, we need to really deal with these issues. And this is kind of more traditional, right? So touching upon digital policy and how that's further evolving. I think this was also in the paper in the EU, at least since 1990s, regulation of the markets followed this neoliberal model. And the idea is that we have laws that regulate the market realm and market failure. That's how it would be defined. And we have laws that regulate public realm. And digital markets and platforms and whatever happened there was very much in the market realm. So that's why a lot of issues along the way actually perhaps even occurred. Because we regulated it strictly as markets, and over time we're now observing, well, actually these platforms have grown to a certain degree, and they also have a lot of impact on fundamental rights on individuals. And there's, especially with increasingly user-centric digital economy, we're thinking, well, market regulation and simply addressing market regulation may not be sufficient. I understand that. Yeah. So very briefly, we're moving towards, the digital policy is moving much more towards protecting citizens' values. And there are a few challenges along the way when we think about user influencing practices specifically. So I think currently, if we think about, I kind of lost it, I'm very sorry, because I have some people here working and it's very distracting, but it is on me. So I'm very sorry about that. We have the digital constitutionalism aspect. And in my paper specifically, I wanted to talk about the AI Act, the Digital Markets Act, and the Digital Services Act, because these at the time are very new regulations. And all of them simply touch upon specific aspects of user influencing. So on very, very well problematized issues like subliminal techniques or exploiting persons' vulnerabilities, there were prohibitions installed. Same with the DMA. We had prohibition for ranking content, for example. But when it comes to these far less observed issues, we had a lot of transparency obligations installed. And dark patterns and user influencing is becoming a topic in each of these regulations as well. So at the time when I wrote the paper, it was still a proposal at proposal stages. Now each of them kind of mention dark patterns in one way or another, deceptive design. But the problem, of course, is that there's the regulatory challenge, of course, is that there is a very big lack of observability of these complex systems. And when we think about hyper-nudging specifically, detection is one of the biggest problems. Even with dark patterns, we don't have automated detection systems that would be able to capture the prevalence of these practices. And there's also a problem of lack of shared vision of harms and how we're trying to address them. So what is the harm? Each field has a different idea. And current regulatory focus, of course, is on transparency, as I mentioned, to kind of increases detectability. And it's a positive right step in the right direction. I kind of realize that I'm out of time, so I'll leave it here. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much to our speakers for these wonderful presentations. Now we have some time for questions. I don't know if the people in the audience have some questions to ask to the speakers. Okay, so I think we don't have questions in our online platform. So I think this will be it. Thank you very much for your participation and for being with us today. We hope to see you in another occasion. Thank you very much.